In this video, we're going to look at configuring EAP TTLS using the Juniper Mist Access Assurance solution. Now let me talk you through my lab setup for this example. In my lab I have two laptops. These laptops are both configured with different user accounts. So one user is going to connect to my network using one of the peter@mqts.co.uk, and the other laptop is configured with a user account of peter@Mackenzie Wi-Fi. Now these two users and machines are going to connect to the same SSID configured on a Juniper Mist access point, which is going to authenticate our users with the Mist Access Assurance solution. Now there's two different cloud services we're going to be using in this video. There is the Access Assurance Cloud and the Juniper Mist Cloud. Now you can think of the Access Assurance Cloud, that is our authentication, if you want to think of it as a cloud-based Radius server. But we configure and manage this cloud-based Radius server via the Juniper Mist Cloud. So this really is a headless service, and all the configuration and all the monitoring of what this Access Assurance Cloud is doing is done via the Juniper Mist Cloud. So this is all our configuration and management. So what happens is we configure an SSID on our Juniper AP. It's going to be configured for .1x, and for the Radius server configuration, all we do is we say we want to use the Mist NAC solution, which basically allows the AP to make a connection and tells it that the Radius server is going to be the Access Assurance Cloud. When a user connects to this AP, the Access Assurance Cloud will send a certificate to the clients, which it will need to validate, and having validated the server-side certificate, the clients will be able to create and establish an encrypted tunnel all the way to the Access Assurance solution. In this encrypted tunnel, it will then be able to authenticate using its username and password. Now the Access Assurance solution doesn't know any usernames or passwords, so it's going to use a third-party directory service to look up the users. And in the case of the lab I'm going to show you, I've actually got two different third-party identity providers configured. I've got a Microsoft Azure identity provider and an Okta, which is another cloud-based directory service. And based upon the domain name of the user will depend which identity provider I use. So for the mqts.co.uk domain, it will be we will check the user account and credentials via this identity provider, and for the Mackenzie Wi-Fi domain, we're going to look at Okta. So that's the lab setup we've got. Let's take a look at how this is configured. So in my Mist environment here, for all the videos in this series on Access Assurance, I've got some different wireless LAN set up. Today we're looking at my NAC TTLS wireless network. So if we just take a look at the SSID, we can see we've called it NAC TTLS. I've configured it for WPA3 802.1x, and when we get to authentication servers, I've picked Mist Auth. That just says I want to use the Access Assurance Cloud as my authentication server. You know, I could have picked a third-party Radius server or some other sort, but for this one, because I'm using Access Assurance, that's how I tell it I want to use Access Assurance. And that, in terms of configuring the SSID, that is about all we need to do. So that's the SSID. how do we actually go about configuring the access assurance solution? Well, we do that from Organization menu, and underneath Organization we have this access menu options here, and this is where we configure all our access assurance. So first thing we're going to look at is configuring our third-party identity providers. If you remember from our diagram, there was two I want to configure, both Microsoft Azure and Okta. So if I come into identity providers here, you can see I've got these both configured. We'll take a quick look at them in turn. Let's look at the Azure one first. So in Azure, I've configured it for OAuth. That's the type of authentication we're going to do. And then there's some information I've had to put in. There's a tenant ID, there's an OAuth client credentials, there's a secret key I need to put in, and also OAuth password credentials, which happens to be the same as a client ID. So where does this information come from? Well, this information actually comes from Azure. So inside Azure, when we look at my Microsoft Azure here, the tenant ID is there on my dashboard. So I literally just have to copy and paste that in. As for the other information, we're going to create that when we create an application which allows Mist to connect to Microsoft Azure, and that's done in app registrations. And inside here you'll see I've got one called Mist, and if I click into here, you can see I've got some tenant IDs, and I've also got a secret. I created that secret. Initially there was no secrets, and I came in here and I added a new secret. So I've got a secret which is just a secret that Mist knows and Azure knows, which allows it to connect. That's how we're going to authenticate. So I've created this application, and by copying and pasting that information into here, it allows my Mist cloud, or what will actually be my access assurance cloud, to connect to my Azure cloud and look up users and groups for my users. Now what I've also configured is I've said the domain here is mqtx.co.uk. So I'm saying any requests for users which in its domain, mqtx.co.uk, then this is the identity provider that knows about those user accounts. Coming back into here, I've also got an Okta set up, and it's very similar. There's a tenant ID, but this time I've picked the domain mackenziewifi.com. So any user that has the domain mackenziewifi.com will get authenticated via Okta. And again, the information here we get from Okta itself. I'm actually just signed out here. Now again, in Okta, very much like other services, you have to create an application, and we've got a user auth and an authc accounts I've created, but these are just applications, and we get our client IDs and all our information from here. I'm not going to go through the entire process of creating Okta apps. There is documentation for doing that on the Juniper Mist documentation site, but it's a similar thing to the Microsoft Azure. We create applications and then we copy the information out of here into the configuration inside Mist. So we get a link between both identity providers. So that's how my identity providers created. The next thing I'm going to want to do is look at my auth policies. And my auth policies are where I basically sit there and say, who do I want to allow to make requests to me, and what am I going to do when I make a request? Am I going to allow them, or do I want to assign a particular VLAN? So obviously Radius servers could assign users based upon their credentials into a particular VLAN. For this simplistic example, I'm just going to allow them access to the network. But if I wanted to return a VLAN as a radius attribute, I could add it in here. And the role I've got set up for TLS is I say anyone who's in the wireless users group. So that is a group which has come from the identity provider. It says, yep, this user is allowed access to the network and they're a member of these groups. So if they're in the wireless users group and they're authenticating using TLS, allow them access to the network. That's all I'm doing with this policy. So let's take a look at this wireless users group. In Microsoft Azure then, in groups, we can see I have a wireless users group and I have got 2 members in this group at the moment. And one of these users is Peter McKenzie, Peter at MQTS. This is a guy with our account we're going to use in our lab environment. So he is a member of the wireless users group. I've got a similar thing going on in Azure. I have got a group and I've got one called wireless users, and I've added some accounts into that as well. So wireless users is a group which exists in both of my identity providers. So if a user is in that group and they're connecting via TLS, I'm going to allow them access to the network. That's how simple I'm making this. So let's take a look at what happens now when we configure a client and what's going to happen now. When configuring a client, they obviously need to be able to validate the certificate of the Access Assurance Cloud. So how do we get that certificate? Well, we can do that through certificates, and in here I can say view MITS certificate, and this is the MITS Cloud Radius server effectively certificate. And one thing I can do is I can download that certificate. So now when I'm configuring my devices, I need to install that certificate. If it's a Windows client, it'll go into the trusted root certificate authority. Or if it's going on to a mobile client, I'll need to push that out via maybe an MDM, or normally have some sort of profile. So a couple of ways we can think about it. If we wanted to push this out to an iPhone, one of the tools I often use is the Apple configurator. If I just open up one of my predefined templates, in the Apple configurator, we can configure an iPhone to do TLS, because by default it's going to try and use PEEP and not TLS. So inside here, you're going to really configure a couple of things really. You want to put in the certificate. So my certificate's already in here, but if it wasn't, I could pick my certificate I've just downloaded and it'll be added in here. And then I want to set the wireless settings up. And the important thing is, I say this is using TLS. And if I want, I can pre-put in a username and password, or I can leave it so it's going to prompt a user. And then all I need to do is take this profile and open it on an iPhone or an iPad, and it will configure my device along with its certificate. On there. On a Windows machine, then what we could do is we could install the certificate we've just downloaded, open it on a Windows machine and import it into our Trusted Root Certificate Authority. Okay, so that's a little bit about the client configuration. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and connect a user up, and then we'll have a look at, it should meet this rule. So we should get an additional hit on our hit counter, and we'll also have a look at some of the traffic we see. On this as well. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to turn the Wi-Fi on one of my clients, and we are going to connect to EAP TTLS. Now we can already see my hit count has gone up to 5. So I've hit this rule, and if I show NAC events, we can see there is a set of events which has occurred for my client I have just connected. So we'll have a quick look through this set of events, and they're the ones that are all around 224. So there's 4 events. The first one is NEC server certificate validation. So this is telling me that it's the SSID is NEC TTLS. The user was Peter at MackenzieWiFi.com. It is a Juniper MITS vendor, and the client has successfully said it's validated its certificate. So it had that certificate in its Trusted Root Authority. We then get a IDP authentication success. It's saying it's authenticated my username and password via the NAC using the IDP of Okta. So it's gone off to the Okta identity provider. When we look at the IDP group success here, we can see that my client came back, and the identity provider, which was Okta, said it was had some roles, everyone and wireless users. And that's right, because my user account in Okta is in 2 groups. It's in the group called everyone and the group called wireless users. And because it was in wireless users, the NEC rule allowed access, and I was allowed access to the network. So we can see my connection there. If I look at the insights just for this particular client, you will also see the same NAC events happening here. And then you can see it got DNS and DHCP as well. So we can see that on the client insights as well. Okay, that's the first client. Let me now connect my next client. So again, I'm just going to come back into auth policies. And I'm going to turn on Wi-Fi on my second client, who's also going to connect to the same SSID. Now you can see the hit counter is 6. So we've another client's hit this rule. And when I show NAC events, we can see there's another set of requests. So this time we've got a client, but this time the client's Peter at MQTS, not Mackenzie Wi-Fi. It's connecting to the next TLS, and it's validated the client certificate. And the client's been successfully authenticated via an IDP, but this time it's gone up to Azure, not Okta, because it's got a different domain. We can see that it's looked it up and it got told that this user was a member of the wireless users group, and therefore it's been allowed. And it's been allowed because it meets its rule. It was using EAP TTLS. It was a member of the wireless users group, so it's allowed access on my network. And that is how simple it is to configure EAP TTLS using the Juniper Mist Access Assurance solution. Thank you for watching.